Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Several years ago, I went down to Guatemala. It's not important why. The only thing you need to know is that me and a few others were going to be meeting one-on-one with a bunch of locals over about 2 weeks. Me and a colleague. She's not important. I discover early on that many of the women we talk to are scared to go to the hospital. Try to figure out why, but locals won't say. Make a note of it and move on. We were on a tight schedule. I don't forget about it though. Going forward, I make a point of gauging how everyone feels about the hospital. It's clear they're uncomfortable talking about it. This is ringing alarm bells in my head, because it's very pertinent to why I'm here in the first place. Anyway, there's a local doctor I'm in close contact with. Call him Dr. Gómez. He works at the hospital in question. Second day of my arrival, I meet up with him. I tell him what I'm hearing so far. Now, most of you reading this will think, these are ignorant peasants, they're probably just scared of modern medicine. But take it from someone who works closely with Central American rural farmers and villagers all the time, that's just a cliché. Many are deeply superstitious, of course, but they're not scared of modern medicine. They just think modern treatments are less effective than herbal remedies. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is Dr. Gómez actually tries to sell me on this ignorant peasant bullshit. Not in those words. This sets off more alarm bells. It's a very strange thing for a doctor to say about his own community. Now I'm suspicious not just of the hospital, but of Dr. Gómez as well. Keep this to myself. The next day I'm meeting with locals again. For your information, my colleague and I are moving down a list of families. We're about a quarter of the way down this list by the third day. The first few people that we meet with express the same wariness about the hospital that the others did. Again, they won't really say why. About halfway through the day, everything changes. Anytime I bring up the hospital, people sing its praises. It's like that for the entire rest of the day. I'm puzzled. What do I make of this turn of events? Decide to follow a hunch. The next day I backtrack. My colleague continues moving down the list, meeting with locals while I revisit a few families that we've already talked to. Suddenly all of those people are changing their tune. I mentioned that they expressed concerns about the hospital before. They deny it. I become more direct, reading from my notes. They still deny it. Then it hits me. They're all parroting the same thing. It's like someone's been coaching them. Fuck. I guess I've got to tell you a bit more about why I was there to explain this next part. So I was sent down to Guatemala because there's an obesity and diabetes epidemic down there. Local government was working jointly with doctors and scientists to develop a nutritional guideline. Nobody follows it. Government is perplexed. I was brought in to have a roundtable discussion with the local scientific community to work on resolving what they regarded as a cultural issue. Dr. Gómez was one of the participants in this discussion. All participants were provided with the list that my colleague and I would use in conducting our interviews with the locals. So Dr. Gómez had this list. I thought about his suspicious hand waving and the fact that roughly, after I'd spoken with him, everyone began changing their story. Realize I'm about to be totally stonewalled if I don't do something. So I decide to go off script. I jump to the end of the list. Visit a family living at the outer edges of the village. When I get there, I see Dr. Gómez leaving. He doesn't even notice me because he's holding the damned list, reading through it. But he looks up and his reaction confirms my suspicions. Surprise, concern, anger. But he plays it off quickly. Tells me he's surprised to see me out here already. I ask him what he's doing. Making a house call. I ask what about physician-patient privilege. He tells me very curtly that he has to go. I decide to go ahead and talk with the family. I find the wife alone. Of course, she doesn't tell me anything. She's obviously scared, but when I bring it up she says she just doesn't feel well. So I ask if she wants me to take her to the hospital. I see panic in her eyes as she tells me, no, she just has a headache or something. Keep in mind she's acting like this after pretty much parroting what all the others said, singing the hospital's praises. Something's going on here and it's getting buried, I can feel it. That night, I'm in my room, staying in a small house with my colleague. I'm thinking through my interviews and looking through my notes. It's very late and I should be in bed when I hear footsteps outside my window. I glance outside but nobody's there. By this point my suspicions have kind of got my anxiety heightened. I'm a researcher after all, and part of my training involves knowing when you're stepping on people's toes. I could sense that when I ran into Dr. Gómez earlier today. I'm wondering if maybe there's something bigger here than I realized. I hear some movement at the front door. I get up and slowly make my way over to it. Through the gap at the bottom, I see someone's shadow. Then it walks away. Footsteps recede. Soon it's silent. I don't open the door right way. But when I feel it's safe, I check outside. A strange item is lying on the ground. I'm not sure what I'm looking at first. Looks kind of like a homemade doll. But it's not. It's actually a handful of sticks, all sharpened to a point, each approximately 6 inches long, tied together with a piece of twine. About to pick it up when I realize that a couple of the sticks are actually bones. I don't know much about anatomy, but it looked like maybe a forearm bone, like an ulna, that had been snapped in 2 pieces and bound up with the rest of the sticks. This weird little bundle also has writing all over it. Look closer. They're not words, but ideograms or hieroglyphs. Some of the characters actually resembled Chinese. I'm describing all of this just to give you an image, but the important thing is what was underneath. Hard to tell in the dark, but pretty sure it was a pool of blood. I heard movement again and I looked around. Couldn't see much of anything. Decided to leave the thing there. Go back inside. Figure I'll tell my colleague before we leave the house the next morning so she doesn't freak out. I do this. But when I go to show her the item, it's gone. My colleague thinks I'm playing a trick on her. I insist that I saw what I described to you. She has a hard time believing me. Understandable. There isn't even a stain where I said I saw blood. In the end she just shrugs and says we should forget about it. Fast forward. The 2 weeks are over. We're preparing to leave. In the end I never discovered why the locals were frightened of the hospital. Since they'd changed their tune I couldn't even mention it in my policy recommendation. So I wrote some report on cultural competency urging the scientific community to engage with locals on one-on-one in the hopes that something would come to light. I never heard anything more on the matter. But I talked to my colleague a few months later. Brought up the weird item. She said she'd been meaning to tell me something. That morning, when I told her about the item. Afterwards, we'd resumed our work, visiting dozens of locals. She was especially eager to finish up our final report. But during that time, in a few different houses, she noticed items like the one I described to her. Some were pretty different but some were almost identical. She saw clumps of dirt and moss tied together. Sticks tied together with twine, sharpened to a point. Some had writing, some didn't. When these objects did have writing, she noticed it looked like Chinese, or like hieroglyphs, exactly like I had described to her. Of course, she was struck by this. But she was pretty consumed with the wrap-up process since we were nearing the end of our stay. Plus it just didn't seem relevant to our report. Still, she jotted down notes about these items just in case. Later, after we left, she looked over her notes and made a weird discovery. These items were all concentrated within a specific area. Every single household was sitting more or less in the perimeter of the hospital. A big circle all the way around. She believed this was likely a coincidence. I still don't know what to think.
Given the fact you were in Latin American territory, it sounds like, sadly, you were dealing with a public health system so shitty the population is scared of it. That happens all the time around here. I live in Mexico and I can tell you a couple horror stories I've heard from public hospitals. Unnecessary amputations. Newborn babies having their skulls crushed with forceps by negligent technicians, etc. Enough to spook anybody in my opinion. Not sure about the objects you found though. Probably some cultural or ritual thing to keep evil away. Scare the ghosts. Protect yourselves from bad juju. You can see that a lot in rural areas or poor, underdeveloped communities.
Thanks for actually responding, Anon. Actually, if you could elaborate on some of the medical issues you mentioned, I'd love to hear some of those stories. As for the object, I'm interested in exactly what belief system it's associated with. I'd never seen an object like that before, and I haven't since.
Objects in Latin American are a common thing amongst most of the many different local beliefs, cults, so hard to tell. And the medical issues are a common thing. The doctors can also get away with most of the issues, and you can get a doctor's position with fake papers easy. In more rural areas, no wonder the locals are afraid, as the doctors can just come to your house and take you away for pretty much any reason. She is just sick and hysteric, and well, torture you in the hospital. Some might be run with some cult, gang affiliations, some just with bad people. The stories don't get out as much because of the no internet thing for rural farmers.
Granted, I was only there for 2 weeks, but I was surprised by the quality of the medical community there. This place had nutritionists, chemists, physicians, all high caliber from what I saw. This is what made the behavior of the doctor I mentioned so unusual. It seemed unlikely to me that a lone doctor could get away with anything shady while being surrounded by a serious medical community. Your suggestion of gang affiliations was really what worried me while I was there.
Spent 3 months in various parts of Brazil, some time in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but most was in rural mountains, work-related. Most of the locals are chill farmers and do not care about that stuff. But same areas seem to be run by cult, gang, and they seem way off right away. Like small villages, and you can just sense it when driving in there. Creepy. They can grow pretty good crops up there, so that might be what makes them more susceptible to gangs taking over.
Yeah, same in central Mexico. I think it was just after NAFTA, pepper production shifted almost entirely to Mexico. Gave them a huge boom, but it came at the cost of the common laborers themselves. We've found people who are virtual slaves through shady company policies by which employees become indebted to employers. Lots of them are kids too, younger than 14. That's outright child trafficking, and of course, the atmosphere was tense. But there were several we visited where the workers were entirely tight-lipped in a way that you don't even find when there's slave labor. Pretty likely cartel controlled, and those peppers literally end up in Whole Foods and Walmart.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
On September 30th, 1999, in an act that would later be described as elementary school stupidity, Hisashi Ouchi poured several gallons of high-purity enriched uranium oxide into a stainless steel bucket containing uranyl nitrate. Ouchi immediately saw a flash of blue light emanating from the container. It was the most beautiful and also the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Ouchi immediately felt nauseous. He vomited into the tank and lost consciousness in a matter of seconds. His co-worker Masato Shinohara managed to run 3 paces before losing consciousness as alarms at the Tokamura nuclear facility sounded. When doctors received the 2 patients in Tokyo, they were not yet aware of the extent of damage incurred. A look at Ouchi's chromosomes revealed that they had been shattered like glass. Doctors knew they had no chance to save his life, but were not aware of the horror that was about to ensue. The white blood cell count of both patients was 0. Their skin began to slough off of their bodies. No number of painkillers could give relief to these men who hold the world record for the longest survival rate of anyone afflicted with acute radiation poisoning. Both patients soon lost their ability to speak, and were asked to communicate in writing with doctors. As their physical deterioration began to accelerate, so did their mental state. On the verge of death, one of the final statements written by Masato Shinohara, "Mommy, please," Ochi's intestines began to melt, so doctors put a camera in his rectum to monitor their condition. His muscular tissue broke down to the point where it began to slide off of his bones. He died 82 days after exposure of multiple organ failure in a condition that can be described as skeletonized. How these individuals managed to survive for months in their condition is a modern medical mystery. From a translation of a Japanese documentary, at first, Ochi came into the hospital with just some puffy redness to his skin. Ochi's chromosomes had been hit by a direct blast of radiation and were a jumbled mess. Without this vital blueprint, his cells would no longer be able to regenerate. The first real problem doctors noticed was a drastic decrease in white blood cells. Day 6, he was placed into a sterile, bubble room. The doctors determined that the only way to improve Ochi's condition would be to give him a transplant of cells that would generate white blood cells. Day 7, Ochi receives a transplant from his sister, a match. The doctor would meet with the family every day to candidly discuss his condition. Signs of radiation sickness were beginning to show up on the surface of Ochi's body. A nurse recalls how at first, they were able to use tape on his body, but soon when they'd go to remove the tape, skin would come off with it. Ultimately, there was nowhere left where tape could be used. When his skin started to slough off from the top down, no new cells could be formed to repair the skin. His breathing started to get erratic. At this point, they show a nurse's written record of Ochi and he's saying, "No more, I'm going home. Please stop, Mom." Day 11, to help him breathe, Ochi is hooked up to a ventilator. This meant he'd no longer be able to speak to his family. The family, wife, son, parents, and siblings, visited him every day. Day 18, the transfusion from his sister seems to have worked, and Ochi's white blood cell count returns to healthy levels. A week later, abnormalities are found in his blood. It seemed that the radiation in Ochi's body had damaged the chromosomes in the cells that he received from his sister. Day 27, problems beyond the skin and blood. They show video of his intestines. The membranes are deteriorating. He begins experiencing excessive diarrhea. 3 weeks after the diarrhea starts, the intestines start to hemorrhage. Another video of his intestines, this time with blood. He was given lots of blood transfusions, as many as 10 times in 12 hours. To help his circulation and put less pressure on his skin, Ochi is moved to a special rotating bed. The places where he'd lost skin were seeping blood and fluids. He had to be wrapped almost completely in gauze. A nurse recalls how there was so much fluid leaking that it'd take half a day just to deal with the gauze, and how painful it must have been for Ochi, although they gave him lots of medicine to sleep. His wife recalls how he bled out of his eyes, as if he was crying blood. He was losing 10 liters of fluid a day through his skin and intestines. In order to curb the loss of fluid through the skin, doctors began daily skin transplants with special bioskin. At this point, his skin was pretty much gone. Unfortunately, the bioskin wouldn't adhere to his body. A doctor explains that all the doctors probably knew that Ochi's chances of survival were low, but nobody dared say so out loud. Vocalizing any doubt could have led everyone to start questioning what they were doing and for who. A visibly traumatized nurse recounts how Ochi continued to deteriorate and was hooked up to a machine, and in her losing battle to keep him alive, she wondered, "What am I doing this for?" She had to remind herself that she was doing it for Ochi. 2 months after the accident, as Ochi goes through a continuous process of hemorrhaging and blood transfusions, his heart continues to work hard to pump blood through his body, averaging over 120 beats per minute. The strain on his heart is similar to someone who is running a marathon. Day 59, suddenly, Ochi's heart stops. As the medical staff works to revive him, his heart starts and stops 3 times. After an hour, Ochi's heart begins beating on its own again. The traumatized nurse recounts that she was relieved when his heart started beating again, but implying conflicted feelings. Having his heart stop for an hour affected his brain, kidneys, etc. And his condition quickly declined. His body was essentially being kept alive by machines and medicine. The head doctor admits to debating whether or not to continue treating Ouchi, but says that the family didn't want to give up hope until the very end, and that kept the doctors going. The family was still visiting Ouchi and encouraging him to fight on. Day 65, more problems with the blood. I don't understand the explanation exactly, but his white blood cells were being attacked and decreasing in numbers again. Day 81, the head doctor sits down with the family and suggests that if Ochi's heart stops again, they should let him go. The next day, the wife visits Ouchi and expresses her desire for him to survive through the new year. Day 83, the young son visits and encourages his father to keep fighting. That night, Ouchi died. They show pictures of his muscle tissue and explain that all of his muscles were destroyed except for one, his heart.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.